You know, I have spent my entire life watching people suffer, not from disease or poverty or war, though these are terrible enough. No, I have watched them suffer from something far more insidious. They suffer because they believe they are at the mercy of every wind that blows, every voice that speaks, every circumstance that shifts around them like sand. They wake each morning already defeated, already braced for impact. Someone will say something that ruins their day. Some event will occur that destroys their peace. Some memory will surface that drags them back into old wounds. They live as if they are made of paper and the world is nothing but fire. But what if I told you this is the greatest illusion you have ever believed? What if everything you think makes you vulnerable is actually the very thing that could set you free? I want you to imagine something with me. Picture a lake, perfectly still in the early morning. Now watch as I throw a stone into its center. Ripples spread outward, disturbing the surface, creating waves that reach every shore. Most people believe they are those ripples, tossed about by every stone that falls into their world. But they have forgotten something crucial. They have forgotten that they are not the ripples at all. They are the lake itself. You see, for decades I sat in my study in Küsnacht, listening to people tell me their stories. Brilliant minds, broken hearts, souls twisted into shapes they no longer recognized. And in every single case, without exception, they came to me believing the same fundamental lie. They believed that their inner world was subject to their outer circumstances. That happiness depended on favorable conditions. That peace required the cooperation of others. That their very sense of self hung in the balance of how life chose to treat them. And yet, as I listened deeper, as I looked beyond the surface of their suffering, I began to see something extraordinary. Buried beneath all their pain and confusion was something that no external force could touch, something that remained whole even when everything else fell apart, something that existed independent of approval or rejection, success or failure, love or abandonment. The ancients knew this. They called it many names: the soul, the self, the divine spark. But we have lost touch with this knowing. We have been educated out of our own depth. We have been taught to look everywhere except the one place where true security actually lives. Let me tell you what I discovered in those quiet hours of listening. Every person who walked through my door was searching for the same thing, though they used different words to describe it. They wanted to feel safe in their own skin. They wanted to stop being afraid of what others might think or do or say. They wanted to find some solid ground beneath their feet that would not shift with every change of weather. But here is what fascinated me. The ones who found what they were looking for, the ones who truly transformed, they did not do so by gaining control over their circumstances. They did not do so by surrounding themselves only with people who agreed with them or by avoiding all difficulty and challenge. No, they found freedom through a completely different door. They found it by going inward, by descending into the depths of their own psyche, by making conscious what had been unconscious, by befriending the very parts of themselves they had been running from their entire lives. You see, most of us spend our energy trying to manage the external world. We think if we can just get the right job, the right relationship, the right living situation, the right amount of money, then we will finally be secure. We believe that if we can control how others see us, how they treat us, how they respond to us, then we will be safe. But this is like trying to stop the wind by holding up your hand. The external world will always be in motion. People will always have their own agendas, their own wounds, their own unconscious patterns playing out. Circumstances will always be changing. life will always be throwing stones into the lake. The question is not how to stop the stones. The question is how to remember that you are the lake. Now, when I speak of becoming unaffected by external circumstances, I do not mean becoming cold or indifferent. I do not mean shutting down your heart or numbing yourself to life. That would be another kind of death, another form of unconsciousness. What I mean is something far more alive, far more vibrant. I mean discovering the part of you that can observe your own reactions without being consumed by them, the part that can feel anger without being controlled by anger, the part that can experience sadness without drowning in sadness, the part that can witness fear without becoming fear itself. This observer, this witness consciousness, this is what remains untouched no matter what storms rage on the surface. It is always there, always present, always whole. But we have learned to identify with everything except this essential core of our being. We identify with our thoughts, and so we suffer when our thoughts are disturbed. We identify with our emotions, and so we are tossed about by every feeling that arises. We identify with our roles, our achievements, our relationships, and so we feel threatened whenever these external structures are challenged. But what if you could step back from all of this identification? What if you could recognize that while you have thoughts, you are not your thoughts? While you have emotions, you are not your emotions. While you play many roles, you are not ultimately defined by any role. This recognition, this shift in identity from the temporary to the eternal, from the changing to the unchanging, this is what I call individuation. It is the process by which a human being becomes truly individual, not in the sense of being separate or isolated, but in the sense of becoming undivided within themselves. When you are undivided, when you are no longer at war with aspects of your own nature, when you have integrated what was fragmented and made conscious what was unconscious, something remarkable happens. You discover that you cannot be truly harmed by anything external, not because you have built walls around yourself, but because you have found the indestructible core that was always there. I remember sitting with a woman once, a brilliant artist whose work had been rejected by every gallery in the city. She came to me in despair, convinced that this rejection meant something fundamental about her worth as a human being. She had identified so completely with her role as an artist that when that role was threatened, she felt as if she were dying. But as we worked together, as she began to separate who she was from what she did, something beautiful emerged. She discovered that her creativity did not depend on external validation. Her ability to create, to see beauty, to express truth through her art, this lived in a place that no gallery could touch. The rejection, which had once felt like a death sentence, became simply information about the preferences of certain people at a certain time. Nothing more, nothing less. This is what I mean when I say nothing and nobody will affect you ever again. Not that you will stop caring about people or outcomes, not that you will become immune to pain or disappointment, but that you will discover something in yourself that is beyond the reach of circumstance, something that cannot be given by others and therefore cannot be taken away by others. Now, I know this may sound abstract, even mystical, but it is actually the most practical thing in the world. Because once you touch this unshakable ground within yourself, once you taste this freedom that comes from knowing who you truly are beyond all roles and identities, you begin to live differently. You speak your truth not because you need others to agree with it, but because speaking truth is an expression of your authentic nature. You love not because you need love in return, but because loving is what you do when you are connected to your own wholeness. You create not because you need approval or recognition, but because creation flows naturally from a consciousness that is no longer defending itself against life. The paradox is extraordinary. When you stop needing anything from the external world, when you stop trying to control how others respond to you, you actually become more effective in that world. People are drawn to someone who is not desperate for their approval. Opportunities arise for someone who is not clinging to outcomes. Love flows towards someone who is not demanding love. But this is not a strategy. It is not something you do to get something else. It is simply what happens when you remember what you actually are beneath all the costumes and performances and defenses you have constructed around your essential being. You see, there is something rather curious that happens when you begin to understand this truth about your own indestructible nature. The world does not suddenly become easier. People do not magically become more reasonable. Circumstances do not arrange themselves for your convenience. No, what changes is far more subtle and far more profound. You begin to move through life like someone who has awakened from a long and troubled dream. I think of a man I once knew, a successful businessman who came to me after what he called the worst year of his life. His company had failed, his wife had left him, his children would barely speak to him. He sat in my office, his hands shaking, telling me that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, had crumbled to nothing. But as he spoke, I heard something else in his voice. Beneath the pain, beneath the obvious devastation, there was something that sounded almost like relief. And when I pointed this out to him, when I suggested that perhaps losing everything had revealed something he had never been able to see before, he began to weep, not tears of sorrow, but tears of recognition, because for the first time in decades, he was experiencing himself without the armor of success, without the identity of achievement, without the constant performance of being someone important. And what he found there, in that stripped down state, was not the emptiness he had feared. It was presence. It was aliveness. It was the man he had forgotten existed beneath all the doing and having and proving. This is what I mean when I say that your circumstances cannot ultimately touch you. Not because you are separate from life, but because you are more fundamentally connected to it than you ever imagined. You are not a small, vulnerable creature trying to survive in a hostile universe. You are the universe experiencing itself through the lens of your particular consciousness. When you truly grasp this, when you feel it in your bones, rather than simply understanding it with your mind, something remarkable happens. You stop being afraid of life, not because life becomes less challenging, but because you discover that you are equipped for whatever arises. I have watched people face the most devastating losses, the most brutal betrayals, the most shattering disappointments, and I have seen some of them emerge not broken but somehow more whole than they were before. What made the difference? They had learned to find their ground not in what was happening to them, but in their relationship to what was happening to them. They had discovered what the mystics have always known, that suffering is not caused by pain itself, but by resistance to pain. That anxiety is not caused by uncertainty, but by the demand that life be certain. That anger is not caused by injustice, but by the expectation that life should be fair according to our personal definitions of fairness. When you stop demanding that life conform to your preferences, when you stop insisting that others behave according to your expectations, when you stop requiring circumstances to arrange themselves for your comfort, something extraordinary occurs. You begin to experience what is actually here, rather than fighting with your story about what should be here. And what is actually here is always workable. Always. Even when it is painful. Even when it is difficult. Even when it challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. The raw material of this moment, whatever it contains, is something you can work with once you stop wasting your energy on wishing it were different. I remember walking through the forest near my home one autumn afternoon, watching the leaves fall. Each leaf released its hold on the branch at precisely the right moment, not clinging desperately to what was ending, not rushing toward what was coming, but simply letting go, when letting go was what the moment required. And I thought to myself, this is what it means to be in harmony with life. Not to control the seasons, but to move wisdom. Not to prevent the falling, but to fall gracefully when falling is what is called for. Most human suffering comes from our attempt to live against the grain of existence. We want to be summer in winter, to be spring in autumn. We want to be praised when we deserve criticism, to be understood when we are being unclear, to be loved when we are behaving in unlovable ways. But when you align yourself with what is actually happening rather than what you wish were happening, when you stop arguing with reality and start dancing with it, you discover something that will change everything for you. You discover that you are not at odds with life. You are life expressing itself through your particular form of consciousness. This shift in perspective is what I call psychological maturity. It is the difference between being a victim of circumstances and being a participant in the great unfolding of existence. It is the difference between feeling like life is happening to you and recognizing that you are life happening. When someone insults you, instead of taking it personally, you might find yourself curious about what wound in them is speaking. When you face a setback, instead of feeling defeated, you might wonder what this difficulty is trying to teach you. When you encounter rejection, instead of concluding that you are unwanted, you might see it as information about compatibility rather than worth. This is not positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. This is not pretending that painful things do not hurt or that difficult situations are not challenging. This is something far more practical and far more transformative. This is learning to surf the waves of existence rather than being pummeled by them. This is discovering that your peace of mind does not depend on the cooperation of others, that your sense of worth does not hang in the balance of external approval, that your capacity for joy does not require perfect circumstances. I have seen people find profound happiness in the most unlikely situations. I have watched individuals discover meaning in the midst of loss, purpose in the heart of chaos, love in the face of rejection, not because they were deluding themselves, but because they had learned to draw from a well that never runs dry. This well exists within every human being. It is not something you must earn or achieve or deserve. It is your birthright, your natural inheritance, the gift of consciousness itself. But it has been covered over by layers of conditioning, by years of looking outside yourself for what was always available within. The tragedy is not that this inner resource is absent. The tragedy is that we have forgotten it exists. We have been taught to believe that we are only as strong as our circumstances allow, only as peaceful as our environment permits, only as happy as our conditions warrant. But this is like believing that the sun only shines when you can see it through the clouds. The sun is always shining, the clouds are temporary, and you, in your essential nature, are much more like the sun than like the weather that seems to cover it. When you remember this, when you reconnect with this unchanging core of your being, everything shifts. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, organically, like a plant turning toward light, You begin to respond to life from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness, from strength rather than desperation, from love rather than fear. And the most beautiful thing happens. The very people and situations that once triggered your worst reactions begin to lose their power over you. Not because you have built walls against them, but because you have found a place in yourself that cannot be threatened by anything external. This is freedom. Not the freedom to control your circumstances, but the freedom to be yourself, regardless of circumstances. Not the freedom from challenge and difficulty, but the freedom to meet whatever arises with the fullness of who you are. This is what I discovered in all those years of listening, of watching, of diving deep into the human psyche. That beneath all our neuroses and complexes and defenses, beneath all our fears and desires and endless mental chatter, there exists something unshakable, something that has never been hurt and never can be hurt, something that is always whole, always present, always free. You are not who you think you are. You are so much more than the stories you tell yourself, so much vaster than the identities you cling to, so much stronger than the wounds you carry. And when you begin to live from this deeper knowing, when you start to identify with this essential self rather than with all the temporary costumes you wear, you will understand what I mean when I say that nothing and nobody will affect you ever again. Not because you have become invulnerable, but because you have discovered what was always invulnerable within you. Now, you may be wondering, but what about the people who seem to wound me so deeply? What about those who betray my trust, who speak words that cut like knives, who abandon me just when I need them most? Surely these external forces can reach inside and damage something essential? And here I must tell you something that took me years to understand, something that will perhaps disturb you as much as it liberated me. The people who affect you most powerfully, who trigger your strongest reactions, who seem to have the most devastating impact on your inner world, these are not your enemies. They are your teachers. More than that, they are mirrors reflecting back to you the very parts of yourself you have refused to see. I spent countless hours analyzing what we call projection, this unconscious mechanism by which we cast our own unacknowledged qualities onto others. The person who enrages you carries something you have disowned in yourself. The individual who disappoints you reveals an expectation you have never examined. The one who abandons you points to an abandonment you have already enacted within your own psyche. This is not blame. This is not saying you deserve mistreatment or that others bear no responsibility for their actions. This is something far more profound and far more liberating. This is recognizing that your emotional reactions to others are information about your own unconscious content. I remember a patient who came to me consumed with hatred for his father, a man he described as weak, passive, and utterly disappointing. Session after session, he would rage about this man's failures, his inability to stand up for himself, his pathetic attempts to avoid conflict. And I listened, watching not just his words, but his gestures, his posture, the way he held himself as he spoke. One day I said to him, "Tell me about the parts of yourself that you consider," and as he began to describe his own forceful nature, his aggressive approach to problems, his refusal to back down from any challenge, I saw something extraordinary happen. His voice grew smaller, his shoulders began to slump. He started to sound less like the powerful man he claimed to be, and more like a frightened child trying very hard to be the opposite of what he feared he actually was. The father he despised so much was not separate from him. It was the disowned part of his own nature, the soft and vulnerable aspects he had spent his entire adult life trying to eliminate through sheer force of will. His hatred of his father's weakness was actually his own inner war against his own gentleness, his own need for tenderness, his own capacity for surrender. When he began to see this, when he started to reclaim these rejected aspects of himself, something remarkable occurred. His anger toward his father began to dissolve, not because he suddenly approved of his father's behavior, but because he no longer needed his father to be different in order for him to feel whole. This is what I mean when I say that others cannot truly affect you once you understand the mechanics of your own psyche. Every strong reaction you have to another person is an invitation to look inward, to discover what you have been hiding from yourself, to integrate what you have been rejecting. The colleague who irritates you with their need for attention may be showing you your own unacknowledged hunger for recognition. The friend who disappoints you with their selfishness may be reflecting your own unexamined self-centeredness. The partner who abandons you may be mirroring the ways you have abandoned yourself. When you begin to work with projection in this way, when you start to use your reactions as a compass pointing toward your own unconscious material, something extraordinary happens. People lose their power to devastate you because you are no longer unconsciously dependent on them to carry the disowned parts of your psyche. But there is something even deeper here, something that goes to the very heart of what it means to be human. We are not separate beings bumping against each other in a random universe. We are interconnected at levels we barely comprehend, part of what I came to understand as a collective unconscious that binds us all together. The person who triggers you is not accidentally in your life. They are there because your unconscious has drawn them to you, or you to them, in service of your own individuation process. Every significant relationship, every meaningful encounter, every person who stirs something powerful within you is there to help you become more conscious, more complete, more truly yourself. I think of the relationships in my own life that brought me the greatest pain and the deepest growth. My wife Emma, who challenged my ideas about marriage and forced me to confront my own assumptions about love. My colleagues who questioned my theories and pushed me to go deeper into my own understanding. Even those who opposed me, who criticized my work, who seemed to stand in the way of my progress. Each of these encounters was actually an encounter with myself. Each conflict was an opportunity to see something I had been avoiding. Each disappointment was a chance to examine an expectation I had never questioned. Each rejection was an invitation to find the acceptance I had been seeking outside myself within my own being. When you truly understand this, when you begin to see every relationship as a mirror and every conflict as a doorway to greater self-knowledge, you realize something that will change everything. You are not at the mercy of other people's behavior because their behavior is actually showing you something about yourself that you need to see. The person who lies to you is revealing your own relationship with truth. The individual who betrays you is pointing to the ways you betray yourself. The one who rejects you is showing you the parts of yourself you have already rejected. This does not mean you should tolerate abuse or remain in harmful situations. It means that even as you make practical decisions about relationships and boundaries, you can simultaneously use every interaction as material for your own psychological and spiritual development. I learned to ask myself different questions when someone triggered a strong reaction in me. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" I began to ask, "What is this showing me about myself?" Instead of demanding that they change, I became curious about what in me needed to change. Instead of trying to control their behavior, I focused on understanding my own responses. This shift in focus, this movement from outer blame to inner exploration, this is perhaps the most liberating discovery a human being can make. Because once you realize that your peace of mind does not depend on other people's behavior, once you Understand that your emotional well-being is not at the mercy of external circumstances. You have found the key to an unshakable inner freedom. But let me be clear about something. This inner work, this process of reclaiming your projections and integrating your shadow, this is not easy work. It requires tremendous courage to look at the parts of yourself you have spent years trying to hide. It demands extraordinary honesty to admit that the qualities you despise in others might actually exist within you. There will be moments when you would rather blame someone else than take responsibility for your own reactions. There will be times when it feels much easier to make another person the villain than to examine your own unconscious patterns. There will be days when the old familiar drama of being a victim seems simpler than the challenging work of becoming conscious. But I promise you this: every moment you choose inner exploration over outer blame, every time you use a difficult relationship as a mirror rather than as evidence of how unfair life is, every instance when you reclaim a projection instead of casting it onto someone else, you become a little more free. And as you become more free, as you integrate more of your unconscious content, as you take back the power you have been giving to others to determine your emotional state, something beautiful begins to happen. You start to see other people more clearly, not through the lens of your projections, but as they actually are. When you are no longer using others to carry the disowned parts of yourself, you can actually perceive them without distortion. When you are no longer unconsciously expecting them to fulfill roles they never agreed to play, you can appreciate them for who they truly are rather than resenting them for who they are not. This is what real love looks like. Not the desperate need for another person to complete you, but the capacity to see and appreciate another consciousness without requiring it to be anything other than what it is. Not the demand that someone else provide what you think you lack, but the recognition that you are already whole and can therefore give freely rather than taking desperately. I have watched this transformation occur in countless individuals over the years. They come to me wounded by relationships, convinced that others have damaged them beyond repair. They leave understanding that every wound was actually an opportunity for healing. Every betrayal was a chance to develop trust in themselves. Every abandonment was an invitation to find the love that was always available within their own hearts. This is not some naive optimism that pretends painful experiences are not actually painful. This is the mature recognition that consciousness can transform any experience into wisdom, any wound into a gateway, any suffering into an opportunity for growth. When you live from this understanding, when you approach every encounter with another person as a potential mirror and every conflict as a possible doorway to greater self-knowledge, you discover something remarkable. You stop being afraid of people, not because they become harmless, but because you realize you cannot be harmed in any ultimate sense by anything they do or say. They can certainly cause you pain. They can create difficulties and complications in your external life. They can behave in ways that are genuinely destructive and require you to set clear boundaries or even remove yourself from their presence entirely. But they cannot touch the essential core of who you are, and they cannot prevent you from using whatever they bring into your life as material for your own consciousness and growth. This is what I discovered in my own journey toward individuation, in my own process of becoming whole. Every person who challenged me, who opposed me, who disappointed or betrayed me, was actually serving my development in ways I could not see at the time. They were forcing me to confront aspects of myself I had been avoiding, pushing me to integrate qualities I had been rejecting, compelling me to find strength and wisdom I did not know I possessed. The colleague who criticized my work taught me to trust my own inner knowing rather than seeking validation from external authorities. The friend who abandoned me during a difficult period showed me that I could survive loss and that my sense of worth did not depend on anyone else's loyalty. The family member who never understood my path forced me to develop the courage to be myself regardless of approval or acceptance. Each of these experiences, painful as they were in the moment, contributed to my becoming more authentically myself. Each person who seemed to wound me was actually helping me discover the invulnerable core that no external force could touch. When you begin to see your life this way, when you start to recognize that every person who enters your experience is there to serve your awakening in some way, you realize that you have never actually been a victim of circumstances. You have always been a participant in your own evolution, drawing to yourself exactly the experiences and relationships that would most effectively serve your growth. This does not mean that everything that happens to you is pleasant or easy. It means that everything that happens to you is workable, that consciousness can find a way to transform any experience into greater understanding, deeper compassion, and more authentic self-expression. The person who angers you is teaching you about your own capacity for rage and helping you learn to channel that energy constructively. The individual who saddens you is showing you the depth of your own heart and your ability to feel deeply. The one who frightens you is revealing your own courage and your power to face the unknown. Every emotion they trigger in you is actually your own emotion, arising from your own psyche, pointing to your own unfinished business or undeveloped potential. They are not doing something to you. They are creating conditions in which you can discover something about yourself. When you truly grasp this, when you feel it not just as an intellectual concept but as a lived reality, you will understand what I mean when I say that nothing and nobody will affect you ever again. Not because you become isolated or indifferent, but because you realize that every apparent external influence is actually an internal process. Every seeming outside force is actually an inside job. You are not being acted upon by life. You are life acting upon itself, creating precisely the conditions necessary for its own awakening. And that changes absolutely everything about how you move through the world. Now, you might wonder about those moments when life seems to strip everything away from you at once, when the ground beneath your feet disappears entirely, when every familiar structure collapses, when you find yourself in what I came to call the dark night of the soul. These are the times when people come to me most desperately, convinced that they have been singled out for special suffering, that some cruel fate has targeted them specifically. But I must tell you something that may shock you. These moments of complete breakdown, these periods when everything you thought you knew about yourself and your life crumbles into dust, these are not punishments. They are not evidence that you have failed or that life is fundamentally hostile. They are invitations. Invitations to discover who you are when every mask has been torn away, when every role has been dissolved, when every external support has been removed. I think of a woman I knew, a mother whose child died suddenly and without warning. She came to me months later, hollow-eyed and broken, telling me that she no longer knew who she was. For 20 years, her identity had been built around being a mother. Every decision she made, every priority she set, every dream she carried was organized around this role. And now the child was gone, and with him everything she had thought defined her. She sat in my office weeping, asking me again and again, who am I if I am not her mother? What is the point of anything now? And I understood that she was asking the most important question a human being can ask, though she did not know it yet. She was asking about the nature of identity itself, about what remains when all the temporary forms have been stripped away. Over many months, we worked together to explore this question, not to find quick answers or easy comfort, but to descend into the mystery of what she actually was, beneath all her roles and relationships. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, she began to discover something extraordinary. She was not just a mother, though being a mother had been one expression of her deeper nature. She was not just a wife, though being a wife was another form her love had taken. She was not just a professional, though her work was yet another way she had contributed to the world. Beneath all these identities was something that could not be taken away by death or loss or any external circumstance. She was consciousness itself, expressing itself through all these temporary forms, but never fully contained by any of them. She was love, not dependent on any particular object to love, but flowing freely as the very essence of her being. She was creativity, not limited to any specific outlet, but continuously manifesting in countless ways. When she touched this deeper reality, when she felt it not as an idea but as a living truth, everything changed. Her grief for her child did not disappear, but it was no longer the totality of her experience. Her sadness became one color in a much larger palette, one note in a more complex symphony. She could honor her loss while simultaneously celebrating the love that had made that loss so meaningful. This is what I learned about those times when life strips everything away. They are not random cruelties, but precise surgeries, removing what is false to reveal what is true, dissolving what is temporary to uncover what is eternal. The deeper self, your true nature, cannot be touched by any external loss because it is not dependent on external forms for its existence. But most of us resist this stripping away with everything we have. We cling to our identities, our roles, our familiar ways of being, even when they have become prisons. We fight to maintain structures that no longer serve us because the unknown feels more threatening than the familiar misery. I have watched people hold on to marriages that were killing their souls, jobs that crushed their spirits, friendships that drained their vitality, simply because letting go felt like dying. And in a sense, it is a kind of death. The death of who you thought you were, the death of the story you have been telling yourself about your life, the death of the strategies you have used to feel safe and significant. But what they discover, if they have the courage to let the dying happen, is that what dies was never really alive in the first place. What dies are the masks, the performances, the false selves constructed to win approval or avoid rejection. What dies are the limited ideas about who you are supposed to be based on family expectations or cultural conditioning. What remains, what is revealed in the ashes of these false deaths, is something that was never born and therefore cannot die. Something that exists independent of circumstances, relationships, achievements, or any external validation. Something that is whole in itself, complete in itself, free in itself. This is why I say that the most devastating experiences of your life are often your greatest teachers. Not because suffering is inherently valuable, but because suffering has a way of burning through everything that is not essential, leaving only what is real. The person who betrays you forces you to find the loyalty within yourself. The one who abandons you compels you to discover your own capacity for self-companionship. The situation that humiliates you strips away false pride to reveal authentic dignity. The failure that crushes your ego creates space for your true self to emerge. I remember my own dark nights, the periods when my theories were attacked, when my colleagues questioned my sanity, when I felt isolated and misunderstood. There were times when I wondered if I had lost my way entirely, if the path I was walking led nowhere but to madness and obscurity. But in those depths, in those places where no external support could reach, I found something I had never known was there. I found a kind of knowing that did not depend on the agreement of others, a strength that was not borrowed from external achievements, a peace that existed independent of favorable circumstances. It was in those moments of complete aloneness that I discovered I was never alone. It was in those experiences of total powerlessness that I touched real power. It was in those times when everything seemed meaningless that I found the source of all meaning. This is the great paradox of human existence. We must lose ourselves to find ourselves. We must die to who we think we are, to discover who we actually are. We must let everything we have built collapse to uncover the foundation that was always there. Most people spend their entire lives running from this process. They surround themselves with distractions, fill their time with busyness, seek constant stimulation to avoid the silence where this deeper work happens. They mistake motion for progress, noise for meaning, accumulation for fulfillment. But life has a way of eventually cornering us, of creating conditions where we cannot run anymore, where we must finally turn and face what we have been avoiding, the illness that forces us to slow down, the loss that shatters our assumptions, the failure that demolishes our pretensions, the relationship that ends despite our best efforts to control it. These are not interruptions to your real life. They are your real life, calling you home to yourself, inviting you to remember what you are beneath all the costumes you wear and all the roles you play. When you begin to understand this, when you start to see every crisis as an opportunity for deeper self-discovery, when you recognize that every breakdown is actually a breakthrough waiting to happen, you develop what I call a different relationship with difficulty. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what is this trying to teach me? You stop demanding that life be easier and start getting curious about how challenges might be serving your growth. You stop resenting obstacles and begin to see them as invitations to discover strengths you did not know you had. This does not mean you welcome suffering or seek out pain. It means you develop the capacity to work with whatever arises, to find the gift hidden in every difficulty, to transform every wound into wisdom. I have seen people emerge from the most devastating circumstances, not just intact, but somehow more alive than they were before. They carry a quality of presence that was not there when their lives were comfortable and predictable. They speak with an authority that comes not from external achievements, but from having touched something unshakable within themselves. They have learned what the mystics have always known, that you are not your circumstances, that you are not your history, that you are not even your personality or your thoughts or your emotions. You are the awareness in which all of these things arise and pass away, the consciousness that remains constant through every change. When you know this, really know it, not as a concept but as a felt reality, you understand what true invulnerability means. It does not mean that nothing can hurt you. It means that nothing can destroy the essential core of who you are. Pain may visit you, but it cannot take up permanent residence. Sorrow may move through you, but it cannot define you. Fear may arise in you, but it cannot control you. You become like space itself, vast enough to contain any experience without being limited by it, open enough to allow any emotion without being overwhelmed by it, stable enough to remain centered no matter what storms pass through. This is what I discovered in my years of exploring the human psyche, of diving deep into the unconscious, of working with people who came to me convinced that they were broken beyond repair. None of them were broken. All of them had simply forgotten their true nature, lost touch with the unshakable ground of their being, become identified with the temporary waves instead of the eternal ocean. And when they remembered, when they reconnected with this deeper reality, when they touched a part of themselves that could never be harmed by any external circumstance, they were free. Not free from the human experience with all its joys and sorrows, but free within it, able to fully participate without being destroyed by participation. They could love without desperation, create without attachment to outcomes, give without depletion, receive without obligation. They could feel deeply without drowning, think clearly without being trapped by thoughts, act powerfully without being driven by compulsion. This freedom, this unshakable inner ground, this recognition of your true nature beyond all roles and identities, this is your birthright. It is not something you must earn or achieve or deserve. It is what you are, what you have always been, what you will always be, regardless of what appears to happen to you in the external world. The journey to this recognition is not always easy. It requires tremendous courage to look honestly at yourself, to face the parts of your psyche you have been avoiding, to question the beliefs and assumptions that have been guiding your life. It demands extraordinary patience to allow the process of individuation to unfold at its own pace, in its own way. But I promise you this: every step you take toward greater self-knowledge, every moment you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, every time you face an inner demon rather than projecting it onto someone else, you become more authentically yourself. And as you become more yourself, you naturally become less affected by the opinions, actions, and circumstances of the external world. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop depending on external validation for your sense of worth. Not because you become isolated, but because you discover that true connection comes from wholeness, meeting wholeness rather than neediness, seeking fulfillment. Not because you avoid challenge, but because you develop the inner resources to meet any challenge with creativity and resilience. This is what I mean when I say that nothing and nobody will affect you ever again. You will still feel everything. You will still care deeply about people and causes and outcomes. You will still experience the full range of human emotions and engage fully with the complexities of existence. But you will do all of this from a place of centeredness rather than reactivity, from strength rather than desperation, from love rather than fear. You will move through life like someone who has awakened from a dream of being small and vulnerable and remembered that you are vast and indestructible. And in that remembering, in that return to your true nature, you will find not just personal liberation, but the capacity to serve others in their own journey toward wholeness. Because when you are no longer unconsciously seeking something from others, when you are no longer trying to get them to provide what you think you lack, you can finally see them clearly and offer them what they actually need. You become a presence of peace in a world of agitation, a source of stability in times of chaos, a reminder of what is possible when human beings remember who they truly are, beneath all the stories they tell themselves about limitation and vulnerability. This is the gift you give to the world when you do the work of becoming whole. Not preaching or teaching or trying to convince anyone of anything, but simply being an example of what it looks like to live from your authentic center, unshaken by the winds of circumstance, unafraid of the depths of your own being. And perhaps most beautifully, you discover that this inner work is not separate from your outer life, but intimately connected to it. As you become more whole within yourself, your relationships become more authentic. As you stop projecting your unconscious material onto others, you can finally see and appreciate them as they are. As you develop genuine self-love, you become capable of loving others without agenda or expectation. The world needs people who have done this work, who have found their unshakable center, who can remain clear and compassionate in the midst of collective unconsciousness. The world needs individuals who are not tossed about by every wind of opinion, not devastated by every setback, not dependent on external circumstances for their peace of mind. You have the capacity to become such a person, not because you are special or chosen or different from anyone else, but because this capacity exists within every human being who is willing to look deeply enough, work patiently enough, and trust courageously enough in their own essential wholeness. The question is not whether you can become unaffected by external circumstances. The question is whether you are ready to begin the journey of discovering the part of yourself that has never been affected by anything external, that exists in perfect peace regardless of what appears to be happening on the surface of your life. That part of you is calling, has always been calling, will always be calling. It is the voice of your deepest self, inviting you home to the truth of what you are beyond all the stories, all the dramas, all the apparent victories and defeats of your temporary existence. Listen, listen with everything you have, and when you hear that call, when you feel that invitation, when you touch that unshakable ground within your own being, you will know that I have not been speaking to you about some distant possibility or abstract ideal. I have been reminding you of what you have always known, in the deepest part of yourself, was true. You know, there is something rather curious that happens when you truly begin to understand what I have been telling you. A strange reversal occurs, one that most people are not prepared for. The very moment you stop needing others to behave in a certain way, the very instant you release your grip on how life should unfold, something unexpected begins to happen in your external world. People start responding to you differently, not because you are manipulating or controlling, but because you have stopped unconsciously demanding that they fulfill roles they never agreed to play. When you are no longer desperate for their approval, they often find themselves drawn to give it. When you no longer need their love to feel complete, they discover they want to offer it freely. This is not a technique or strategy. It is simply what occurs when authentic presence meets the world. When you are no longer performing, when you are no longer trying to get something from every interaction, when you are simply being yourself without agenda or expectation, others can finally relax in your company. I have watched this transformation countless times. A person does the inner work, integrates their projections, finds their own center, and suddenly their marriage improves without them trying to fix it. Their children become more open and honest with them. Their colleagues treat them with more respect. Opportunities begin to appear where before there were only obstacles. But here is what fascinates me about this phenomenon. It happens precisely because the person is no longer attached to these outcomes. They have found something within themselves that does not depend on external cooperation. And paradoxically, that very independence creates the conditions for better cooperation to emerge naturally. It is like the difference between a person who is drowning, grasping desperately at anyone who comes near, pulling them down in their panic, and someone who has learned to float, who can extend a hand to help others without being dragged under themselves. Which person would you rather approach if you were struggling in the water? When you are drowning emotionally, when you are desperate for others to save you or validate you or complete you, people sense this unconsciously and often pull away, not out of cruelty but out of self-preservation. But when you have found your own solid ground, when you can stand in your own strength and offer genuine support without hidden agendas. Others are naturally drawn to that stability. I remember a time in my own life when I was so concerned with how my colleagues viewed my work, so anxious about their acceptance or rejection of my ideas, that I could barely function in their presence. Every conversation felt like a test I might fail. Every disagreement felt like a personal attack. I was exhausting to be around because I needed so much reassurance, so much validation, so much proof that I was worthy of their respect. But as I did my own inner work, as I found my own relationship to my ideas and my purpose that was independent of their approval, something remarkable occurred. The very colleagues who had seemed most critical began to engage with my work more openly. The conversations that had felt like battlefields became genuine exchanges of ideas. The relationships that had been strained by my neediness became sources of mutual enrichment. Nothing had changed about them. Everything had changed about me. I was no longer asking them to carry the burden of my self-worth. I was no longer making their opinions more important than my own inner knowing. I was no longer interpreting their professional disagreements as personal rejections. This is what happens when you stop being affected by others in the old, unconscious way. You become someone who can actually be in authentic relationship because you are no longer using relationships to fix something broken inside yourself. But let me tell you about something even more profound that occurs as you deepen this understanding. You begin to see that the very idea of being separate from others, the very notion that you are here and they are there, that you are subject to their influence and they to yours, this begins to reveal itself as another kind of illusion. I spent years studying what I came to call synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that seem to connect our inner psychological states with outer events in ways that cannot be explained by simple cause and effect. A person dreams of a golden beetle and the next day finds one tapping at their window. Someone thinks intensely of a friend they have not seen in years, and that friend calls within the hour. At first, I tried to understand these phenomena through the lens of separate individuals mysteriously connected, but gradually, I began to see something much more radical. What if the separation itself was the illusion? What if consciousness was not locked inside individual heads, but was actually a field, a shared space in which all apparent individuals were swimming like fish in an ocean? If this is true, and my years of observation suggest that it is, then what we call external influences are not actually external at all. They are movements within the same consciousness that you are. The person who angers you is consciousness exploring anger through a particular form. The situation that challenges you is consciousness creating conditions for its own growth and awakening. You are not a small, separate being trying to protect yourself from a hostile universe. You are the universe itself, temporarily focused through the lens of what you call your personality, your history, your particular circumstances. And from this perspective, the very question of being affected by external forces dissolves entirely. How can you be affected by something external when there is no external? How can others harm you when they are other expressions of the same consciousness you are? How can circumstances damage you when you are the field in which all circumstances arise? This is not philosophical speculation. This is what I discovered in the depths of my own exploration. In those moments when the boundaries of my separate self became transparent and I glimpsed the larger reality of which individual consciousness is just a temporary focal point. In those moments, I understood something that changed my relationship to everything. Every person I encountered, every situation I faced, every challenge that arose was not happening to me, but was me, expressing itself through apparently different forms. The colleague who criticized my work was me exploring criticism. The patient who resisted my interpretations was me investigating resistance. The circumstances that seemed to oppose my plans were me creating conditions for deeper understanding. When you touch this level of recognition, when you feel it not as an idea but as a lived reality, the whole question of protection from external influences becomes meaningless. You cannot protect yourself from yourself. You cannot be harmed by yourself. You can only become more conscious of the various ways consciousness expresses itself through the dance of apparent separation. This does not mean that practical boundaries become unnecessary. You still lock your doors at night. You still choose your companions wisely. You still make decisions based on what serves your well-being and growth. But you do these things from a completely different understanding. You are not protecting a small, vulnerable self from a dangerous world. You are consciousness making choices about how it wants to express itself, what conditions it wants to create for its own exploration and development. The person you avoid because they drain your energy is not separate from you. They are you in a form that is not conducive to your current stage of growth. The situation you leave because it feels toxic is not external to you. It is you creating conditions that no longer serve your evolution. From this perspective, every choice becomes an act of self-care, but self-care understood in its deepest sense. You are caring for the totality of consciousness by choosing expressions and conditions that support awakening rather than unconsciousness, growth rather than stagnation, love rather than fear. I know this may sound mystical or abstract, but I assure you it is the most practical understanding you can develop. When you truly grasp that you are not separate from what appears to influence you, when you feel the interconnectedness of all existence not as a concept but as a reality, you discover a kind of power and freedom that is literally unimaginable from the perspective of separation. You stop being afraid of people because you understand they are movements of your own deeper self. You stop being intimidated by circumstances because you recognize them as conditions you have unconsciously created for your own learning. You stop feeling like a victim of life because you see that you are life, exploring itself through countless forms and experiences. But this recognition brings with it a tremendous responsibility. If you are not separate from what appears to affect you, if you are part of the same consciousness expressing itself through all beings and situations, then your inner state, your level of consciousness, your degree of integration and wholeness affects the whole. When you heal something within yourself, you heal it in the collective unconscious. When you integrate a shadow projection, you make it easier for others to see their own projections. When you find peace within your own psyche, you contribute to peace in the world. This is why the inner work is never just personal. This is why becoming whole is not a selfish endeavor, but a gift to all existence. Every moment of consciousness you achieve, every fragment of unconsciousness you integrate, every fear you transform into love, ripples out into the field of shared awareness in ways you cannot even imagine. I have seen this in my own work countless times. When I made peace with a particular aspect of my own shadow, patients began arriving who were struggling with that same aspect. When I resolved an inner conflict, people around me seemed to find resolution more easily in their own conflicts. When I touched a deeper level of acceptance within myself, others began to feel more accepted in my presence. This is not magic. This is the natural functioning of consciousness when you understand that individual minds are not separate containers but temporary formations in an infinite field of awareness. What happens in one part of the field affects every other part, just as a wave in one part of the ocean influences the entire body of water. So, when I tell you that nothing and nobody will affect you ever again, I am not speaking about building walls or developing indifference. I am pointing you toward a recognition so profound that it dissolves the very framework within which the question of external influence makes sense. You are not a separate entity that can be influenced by other separate entities. You are one movement of consciousness recognizing itself through apparently multiple forms. The person who seems to hurt you is you exploring pain. The circumstance that seems to challenge you is you creating conditions for growth. The world that seems to oppose you is you investigating resistance. When this becomes your living reality, when you feel this interconnectedness in your bones rather than simply understanding it with your mind, everything changes. Not because the world becomes different, but because you remember what you actually are within it. You are not a small wave at the mercy of the ocean. You are the ocean itself, playing at being a wave. You are not a temporary personality struggling to survive in a hostile universe. You are the universe celebrating itself through the experience of being a temporary personality. And so we return to where we began, but now you see it differently. The lake remains still, perfect in its depth, untouched by the stones that fall upon its surface. You are that lake. You have always been that lake. The ripples were never you at all. This is what I have spent my life trying to tell you, what every patient who sat across from me eventually discovered in their own time, in their own way, that you are not at the mercy of this world, that you carry within yourself something so vast, so unshakable, so fundamentally whole that no external force can ever truly reach it. The journey to this recognition is not easy. It asks everything of you. It demands that you face what you have been running from, integrate what you have rejected, love what you have despised in yourself. But on the other side of that courage lies a freedom so complete, so profound, that you will wonder how you ever believed you were small. Nothing and nobody will affect you ever again. Not because you have become cold, but because you have remembered what warmth truly is. Not because you have built walls, but because you have discovered that you are the space in which all walls arise and dissolve. You are consciousness itself playing at being human. And that game, that beautiful, terrible, magnificent game, can finally be played with the lightness and joy it was always meant to have.